So what I thought we would do today is to continue and sort of follow the course of thinking, the course of argumentation in Schmitt's The Concept of the Political. And the way I sort of planned it, so let me just sort of say what the plan is that we would try to sort of get to the end, if you wish, or as much as we can of Schmitt's thinking today. And then we would also leave some time next week to discuss it, because of course Schmitt is a controversial thinker, a very influential thinker, and a very interesting thinker. So we would give ourselves also some time, because in my experience, I remember when I was a student, is you go to a lecture, everything's fascinating, but then it's only like 3 days later when you're in the shower that you're like, oh, this is interesting, I don't get this, that there's a kind of delay. So what we can do is next week then we'll just take a few minutes at the beginning to see if we want to discuss things about Schmitt, etc. And then we would do Eucken. Now the Eucken text is being translated, and it's a short text. And that will then, I'll post that on, well, it'll be on the MOOC, so you can get it off the MOOC, but I'll also put it on Toledo on Sunday. It's a very short text. And basically the Eucken, well, I'll talk more about it. The reason why we're interested in Eucken is that, in a sense, he's going to set up Husserl. So my plan is just to spend one lecture talking to you about Eucken and Eucken's wartime writings, partly because philosophically they're not very deep. They're meant to really be pure addresses to peoples. But they are quite important because it introduces a constellation of concepts that then will set up what is going to be something that we'll spend more time on, and that's Husserl's lectures during the war on Fichte. So my thinking is that we'll spend one lecture, one class period talking about Eucken. The text for that, which is now being translated, will be available Sunday night in English. We'll do Eucken then next week after we talk a bit more about Schmitt. And then after that, we'll move to Husserl and then spend 2 weeks on Husserl. Okay, so that's the plan. So what I thought we would do today is pick up the thread of where we left off in our discussion in my presentation of Schmitt, and pick up the thread which was where Schmitt, now, and this is in section 3 of his book, explicitly now starts to speak about Clausewitz. And here, and we'll jump into it in a moment, what's interesting is that one sees very clearly the way in which Schmitt wants to rethink the basic formula, the basic schema, if you wish, the basic proposition of Clausewitz, namely that war is the continuation of politics by other means. So what I thought we would do is spend some time looking at those stretch of pages, which are quite interesting. And like everything in Schmitt, they're very straightforwardly said, but actually quite complicated. And discuss that then we would turn to Schmitt's then critique of sovereignty, his conception of sovereignty, and critique. So there is both a critique of notion of sovereignty, a critique of the notion of the state. Remember that the book begins by saying, look, I don't want to presuppose any concept of the state. And I want to avoid this tautology or this circle that the political is defined by a political entity called the state, sovereignty, and sovereignty defines the political. And here what I want to do is to outline first 2 dominant conceptions or 2 dominant theories of the state that Schmitt rejects and critiques. The first is based on any kind of social contract, so any kind of social contract theory. The second is, and quite importantly, with quite important consequences for his thinking, his rejection of the concept of the state that is based on a theory of law. And then look at his own idea that the state is going to be understood as emerging through the capacity or the instance of deciding who is the enemy. And in other works, which I'll just mention when we get to it in a moment, this is the idea of defining the state through the concept or through the notion of what Schmitt calls the state of emergency or the state of exception. Something which, again, is a quite interesting idea with a lot of influence, and of course, like everything in Schmitt, is also politically quite controversial. So to look at his critique of sovereignty, as well as his own conception of sovereignty, which is embedded in this idea of the political as the antagonism between friend and enemy. Then to also look, since we're thinking about Schmitt in the context of the First World War, in the context of this class, then to look at this quite fascinating set of statements that he makes about sovereignty as a kind of double demand. The double demand is that those who are members of the people, of a state, of a sovereign state, that sovereignty is defined as the capacity or the demand to ask those members to die and to kill. So it's a double demand. So the idea is that what the state is in a sense that power that transcends all forms of human association, and it's the power to demand and to almost stipulate those who will die, and to then stipulate not only those who will die, but those who should be killed, and to empower those who will die as those who will kill. And in the context of, again, the First World War, there's a lot of, one sees quite clearly, one can situate it quite clearly historically, because here though he doesn't use the word specifically, it embeds a theory of sacrifice into his notion of sovereignty. And again, I'll start doing this in the rest of the semester, is that I'll often make references to the MOOC world. Because in the MOOC world, one of the things that we'll look at is this sense of what it is to die for a country. Different conceptions of this sense of knowing that one is about to die, and the critique of this notion, which we'll see when we look at the pacifism of Bertrand Russell. And then in the MOOC, though there's not a lecture on it, but it's in there, there's questions around it. Perhaps the greatest, most iconic poem of the First World War by the British poet Wilfred Owen, Dulce decorum est, where it ends with the line, don't believe in that old lie, Dulce decorum est pro patria more. So that's a Latin line from Horace. How wonderful and sweet it is to die for one's country. And it's one of the great poems of the war by Wilfred Owen, where I won't spoil it for you, read the poem, but it ends by saying, this is a lie, don't believe in it. And it was really something that was an intense debate about the nature of sacrifice. And Schmitt has this, again, quite interesting idea, controversial, that one of the substantial meanings to sovereignty is that entity for which people will die. So if no one is willing to die for Europe, there is no Europe, to put it in today's terms. Because who wants to die for Europe? From a Schmittian point of view, there is no Europe as a political, again, it's an association, but is it political? So I thought we would spend some time looking at that, and then look at, if we have time, if not, we'll do it next time, because again, there's a lot of interesting things in Schmitt to discuss and debate, to then look at, and again, in the context of our interest in the First World War, his quite explicit critique, and at the time, a critique that found great acceptance in Weimar Germany, the critique of the League of Nations, and the critique of the idea of human rights. And when we get to it today, if we get to it today, we can also talk about, again, you have to remind, this book is written in 1927, and to have someone who so clearly articulates a very powerful critique of the League of Nations, and the critique of human rights, and the idea, and a critique of human rights that then other thinkers would take on in different ways. So it's quite an important articulation of a kind of basic suspicion about the very assumptions about an international world order that is being built in the aftermath of the First World War, that continues to be built in the aftermath of the Second World War, which is the world order of today, United Nations, European Union. Exactly, Schmitt in 27 is already, in a sense, trying to destroy it. And so it's something that I thought we could end our discussion of Schmitt by looking at his critique of the League of Nations, critique of humanity. And again, if we don't get to it, then we'll do that then next time. So that's sort of the arc of what I thought we would discuss today. Okay, so let's go back and recall that, and here I'll just summarize a bit to get you back into the mood. The basic contention that what Schmitt is after, and here I'm going to use his language, he's looking for the specific distinction, the substantial definition of the political. And his proposal, his idea, is that the political is not defined by any kind of substance or any kind of agency, but by the intensity of a conflict. And that's a conflict or an antagonism that reaches, again here I'm paraphrasing his text, I'm using his language, that reaches a certain intensity where now the other, i.e. the enemy, is seen as an existential threat. And because, or in light of being seen, or that it is seen or perceived as an existential threat, then the nature of the antagonism, the nature of that intensity, is that the extermination of the other is, as Schmitt calls, a permanent possibility. And here, again, he emphasizes that the distinction between friend and enemy is not a private distinction. It's not a symbolic or metaphor. It's not being a competitor. It's going to be what is distinctively political. And here what's important is two things before we sort of launch back into it. One is, if we go back to Clausewitz, and this is sort of where we left off the discussion, if we think of Clausewitz's proposal to think of war as the pursuit of politics by other means, one of the ambiguities, if you wish, of that distinction or that definition is whether war is an instrument of politics. So conceptually, if you think of what an instrument is, the war is somehow exterior to politics as such. And rather, war is one instrument that politics can use, but politics as such is not war. So one way to interpret Clausewitz is to say, look, when he says that war is the continuation of politics by other means, it's meant to both affirm a relationship between war and politics while at the same time distinguishing war from politics. Precisely because it's an instrument. And precisely because the ultimate aims and objectives of war have to be political. And so there's always the subservience of war to politics. However, one can start to think about that formulation, and we discussed this in class, that Clausewitz doesn't say much about what he means by politics. So a lot of the ambiguity, a lot of the space in which to maneuver interpretively is left open because Clausewitz himself doesn't say much about what he means by politics. He only says enough to think about it in the context of his thinking about war, even though it's absolutely central, this relationship. But if you think about Clausewitz's definition, one can also interpret it in the following way and say that, look, what it's really saying is that there's a deep continuity between war and politics. And it's this interpretive window, if you wish, that Schmitt is going to take. And he's going to push it to an extreme. Because Schmitt is, if you think about the logic of Schmitt's thinking, and this is where we can pick it up. Again, if you have the English, it's on page 32, 33. What we're going to see in Schmitt is not simply the Clausewitzian idea, or let's call it the idea that we can see in Clausewitz, that there's a continuity between war and politics, but indeed that politics is itself war. So what it is to be political is to be in a state of war. Precisely because the political is defined by the existential struggle or antagonism between friend and enemy, where the possibility of exterminating or destroying the enemy is, and here I'm using Schmitt's language, a permanent possibility. So we'll have to think about why is it a permanent, or what's the meaning of permanent? What's the meaning of possibility? Yeah.
Is it Schmitt that is interpreting Clausewitz?
Yes, yes.
That's what he thinks Roosevelt is saying.
No, he's not. He's not. So it's not. And we'll look at. He's not saying this is what Clausewitz is saying.
Okay.
This is what This is what Carl Schmitt, is saying, and what Carl Schmitt, is saying can be seen as a radicalization
Of what Roosevelt has
Yes. Yes.
civil rights.
Exactly. So remember that one of the basic narratives of this class, that's why we started with Clausewitz, is one can map different interpretations or different conceptions of war and the relationship between war and politics in the context of the First World War as different interpretations of Clausewitz. And here, what Raymond Aron, the French philosopher, calls the formula.
So
War is...
all the philosophers now, as we go along, we are going to we're referring to Roosevelt as the basis of...
Not all, but most, yes. In a sense that, it's fairly... so most people understand that if one is going to say something about war, from broadly speaking a philosophical point of view, then in a sense Clausewitz is an unavoidable reference point. Partly because of Clausewitz's tremendous influence, but also because Clausewitz in a sense puts together a framework of thinking with all of its ambiguities, which is the space in which many of these thinkers are themselves going to operate. So, but your question is good, again, and here when we will see that Schmitt is very precise. He's not saying, I'm offering an interpretation of Clausewitz. He's saying, I'm offering an interpretation that can be seen as a radicalization of something in Clausewitz. And why it's a radicalization, though we'll see, like everything in Schmitt, it has a certain degree of subtlety. And again, just to bring it to a formula, so here I'm just going to speak very schematically. Schmitt, one can see Schmitt as inverting the Clausewitzian formula. So if Clausewitz says, and again it's a formula, so it's not yet it's not a thought, it's just a formula. It's a formula that provokes thinking. If the Clausewitzian formula is war is the pursuit of politics by other means, one could interpret Schmitt as saying that politics is the pursuit of war by other means. And what I will come to in a moment, but later on, as a footnote, I'll mention a few things about Michel Foucault. So Foucault, in his lectures at the Collège de France, called Il faut défendre la société, so society must be defended, has a very fascinating discussion about Clausewitz and the development of the concept of war in the 19th century, the concept of race. And Foucault then, quite startlingly, has a kind of even more radical idea than Schmitt, because Foucault is going to say that all politics is fundamentally modeled on war, on the idea of a social war. And so it's going to be an even more radical idea in the sense that it's a radicalization. So, and I'll come to it in a moment, I'll just point to you in that direction. But just to bring it to a formula, and again, it's just a formula, that in a sense, one way to read Schmitt is to say, and we'll look at the details, that Schmitt is saying, look, if politics is based on the distinction between friend and enemy, so the intensity of an antagonism becomes political when we now recognize the other as an enemy. And what it is to recognize the other as an enemy is to recognize the other under, if you wish, the transcendental condition of their destruction. It's a permanent possibility. Then one way to think about it is that what he's saying is that then what politics is fundamentally war. Now, we'll see that Schmitt, not in this book, but in another book, makes a distinction between what he calls the state of war, so war as a state and war as action. Because in one sense, of course, war as an action, and that's why we'll turn to the text in a moment, he talks about the battle, is limited in space and time. So I invade a country or what have you. So that's what he calls war as an action. But the state of war, which seems to be synonymous with the state of the political, is a context in which there is an antagonism between friend and enemy. And then the permanent possibility of war is the permanent possibility of moving from the state of war to the action of war. So what we'll see, and so this is the thing that now we'll explore in greater detail, is it's a quite important inversion. Again, inversion because now it makes almost synonymous politics with war. So politics is fundamentally a form of conflict, though Schmitt is then quick to say that I don't mean thereby that politics is always armed conflict. But insofar that politics is always about conflict, then in a sense, the fundamental mode of politics is to be in war. Though this notion of war is detached from a military notion of war, because the military notion of war is precisely then when it becomes armed conflict. So if we look now at page 32, 33, I'll just sort of point out where you see this sort of, in one sense, it's kind of a subtle distinction that he makes, that politics, so in a sense what Schmitt wants to say is that politics is essentially a war, but politics is not the armed conflict of war. So it's not that politics is always in the action of war, but politics is always the state of war. So he says again on 32, 33, he says, look, for to the enemy concept belongs the ever-present possibility of combat. So you see this distinction between combat, so war as action, and enemy as the state of war. And the present possibility of combat is always there. And then he says war is armed combat between organized political entities. Civil war is armed combat within an organized unit. And then on 33, the friend, enemy, and combat concepts receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. War is the existential negation of the enemy. So at that point, in that paragraph, you see a very strong association that politics is war. Now, politics is not necessarily armed combat, but it's war, insofar that the antagonism is one that is existential. But then Schmitt now makes this qualification. He then says, well, look, it's by no means as though the political signifies nothing but war, and every political deed is a military action. So you can see how he first says, look, politics is the distinction between friend and enemy, and what gives meaning to the enemy is the possibility of destroying the enemy. And war indeed is precisely that, the existential negation of the enemy. So that's where you see the closest moment of almost the complete identification of politics with war. But then Schmitt says, but what I don't mean to say is therefore that politics is nothing but war, and that every political deed is a military action. And indeed, he then suggests, and here we can debate what he's trying to say, he then says that the definition of the political neither favors war nor militarism, neither imperialism nor pacifism. So you can see, like everything in Schmitt, it's very cagey. You understand the word cagey? Right? It's very shrewd. So cagey, it's like a poker player, right? Because on the one hand, war is the existential negation of the enemy. That's the political. But my definition of political does not favor war. And it doesn't favor militarism. So you can ask yourself, again, cagey means, are you trying to say having it both ways, or is there some real subtlety here? And it's at this point that he launches into the discussion of Clausewitz. So let me sort of go through it, and then we can discuss it. He then says the military battle itself is not the continuation of politics by other means. So this is on page 34. So this is the moment where, again, you can see Schmitt is clearly thinking about Clausewitz and trying to position his own understanding of the relationship between the political and war with reference to Clausewitz. So he says, the military battle itself is not the continuation of politics by other means, as the famous term of Clausewitz is generally incorrectly cited. War has its own purposes, etc., etc. And then he says, war is neither the aim nor the purpose, nor even the very content of politics, but as an ever-present possibility, it is the leading presupposition which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and thereby creates a specifically political behavior. So maybe we can stop and just try to discuss what that means, because it's actually a quite complicated and for some people sort of incoherent idea. So on the one hand, he says war is not the purpose or aim, nor even the very content of politics. So you can see that he wants to keep a distinction between war and politics. So basically he's saying that that politics is not war. It's not, so the aim of politics is not war. On the other hand, war is what he calls the ever-present possibility, and here we have to interpret what he means, the leading presupposition, which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and thereby creates a specifically political behavior. And I think here it really comes down to understand what he means by the leading presupposition, the permanent possibility. So the sense in which the aim of politics, the content of politics is not war, but insofar that war is the presupposition of politics, then that's the sense in which politics is the continuation of war by other means, without thereby politics being reduced to the execution of war at all times. And here, that's the sense in which he wants to amplify this existential meaning of the friend-foe distinction, that in a sense all politics always is about a fundamental form of conflict, and here I'll formulate it a bit differently, in which no party can be neutral. So that might be another way to formulate what Schmitt is saying, that politics in Schmittian sense is a conflict where there is no space for neutrality, precisely because one is either in the community of those who are friends. And it's quite interesting here that he defines the notion of politics through the notion of friendship. Because those who are against me, the me is a community. And that is a community of friends, again, in a political sense. So within the community of friends, a genuinely political conflict is a conflict where there is no space for neutrality. And in the context of the First World War, you'll see this in the MOOC, so now I'll make a jump to the MOOC. In the fourth part of the MOOC, when we look at pacifism, the first section is on the French writer Romain Rolland, who was a very important pacifist who, right at the beginning of the war, started to write all these pacifist manifestos, the most famous of which is called, in French, Au-dessus de la mêlée, so above combat, going above battle, where he basically says, basically one should rise above this antagonism and what's interesting between Germans and the French, and try to find reconciliation because we share the same cultural values, etc. And one of the fascinating things about Rolland, so this is just to anticipate what you'll do in the MOOC, is whether it's possible to write a pacifist manifesto that itself isn't structured by antagonism. And the Rolland text is a fascinating text because he addresses it to the Germans and to a German writer called Gerhard Hauptmann, and says, look, I'm going to speak to you not as an enemy. But as the text develops, it's impossible not to speak to the other as an enemy in the context of war. And this might be one way to understand what Schmitt here is suggesting, that war is this leading presupposition, that the intensity of the conflict, and here I'll speak very loosely, is so intense, is such amplification that everyone is already committed to a side by the very nature of the conflict. And in a sense, there is no subject who can be neutral. So, no subject within the parties who are antagonistic to each other. Of course, if you're a third party from Mars, you look at it and you say, I don't care. But within the logic of confrontation, in a sense, the force of politics is precisely to create a space of conflict in which, again, just to repeat myself, no one who is implicated in the conflict can exclude themselves from partisanship. And again, just in the First World War, you see that that's the tremendous challenge, is it possible to truly be a pacifist without having any hostility? And without pacifism itself being a form of antagonism. We'll come back to it because Schmitt comes back to this where he asks the question, is it possible to have a war against war? Where he critiques the very idea of pacifism and he says, look, true pacifism would itself have to be a war, namely a war against war, and therefore succumb to the very logic of the political, which it putatively tries to reject. And that's going to be his basis for, or one of the bases for his critique of human rights and League of Nations. Something which in the present context, just to spin out the tremendous range of these thoughts, the idea is that wars against humanity are hypocritical. Precisely because it's, in a sense, they are wars, they are antagonisms, and now the language of antagonism is the language of humanity, of universality, etc., which creates the other as the enemy that has to be negated by creating the other as the inhuman, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. So you can see there's something quite powerful to the idea that true political antagonisms are antagonisms where there is no neutrality. There is no subject who is neutral. And that's then, and now here I'll end it with here, we can discuss it, because again, I'm just showing you the different ways in which you can think about it without trying to say this is the way to think about it. Then this idea that armed conflict, so politics is the basic condition of war because all politics is conflict. Now, that conflict is not necessarily armed conflict, but all politics is conflict. So it's polemos. So if you want a kind of, Greek vocabulary, because you're Heideggerian and you can only think philosophy in Greek, the space of logos, the space of speech, is predicated on polemos. So polemos opens the space in which there is something like the space of speech. If the space is, so that's the sense in which it reverses Clausewitz, that politics is the pursuit of war by other means, i.e., by means that are not armed conflict, but are nonetheless embroiled in a conflict. And a conflict that, as we'll see, seems to be irresolvable. So it's existential. So this is the sense in which he says that the extreme case being armed military, so actually the actual killing of the other, is an exception. So it doesn't always happen. So the nature of politics is not immediately to kill your enemy. That's what he's saying. But on the other hand, precisely because it's the exception and the extreme, as he says, it confirms the nature of what politics is about. So again, I want to see that it's a quite subtle kind of argument to say, precisely because the actual killing of the other is an exception to politics, though politics is fundamentally about, in a sense, wanting to kill the other, when we do kill the other, i.e. when we actually start dropping bombs on the other guy, then this confirms the very nature of what politics is about. And then, so then we'll set up the point that we'll come to in a moment when we think about his conception of sovereignty, the idea that, as Schmitt argues, that sovereignty is what he calls the power to decide the state of exception. So precisely to open a form of antagonism which is beyond the law, which is an exception to the law, and specifically the exception to international law. And it's a state of exception precisely because when the state sends me to war, the state then says, I'm allowed to kill other people, which normally, you don't do. So, we don't kill other people unless the state tells us to. That's the power of sovereignty. And we would be, as we will see, Schmitt has this interesting, we would be sort of foolish to say, I want to die for, Anderlecht or OHL Heverlee. But we wouldn't be foolish to die for our nation, because if I die for my nation, I get a statue. And I get a medal. I become the hero. So this will set up this very important idea of the notion of sovereignty through the notion of the state of what Schmitt will call the state of exception, the state of emergency. Let me just read one more thing and then we can discuss it to get into the debate. He then arrives, again, what we're trying to do is work through this complex landscape of Section 3, where he's trying to really work out the details of how he understands the relationship between politics and war against the background of Clausewitz. So it goes back to your remark. He then says, and this is, again, you have to, I mean, it's quite bold, and also you have to put in 1927, I mean, also today. Oh, this is on page 35. A world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated. So the Kantian notion of perpetual peace. Because remember that in Kant's famous essay, Kant says, look, perpetual peace is not a condition in which countries are not fighting wars. It's a condition, a historical epoch, in which states or princes are not disposed to fight wars. So simply the fact that we're not fighting doesn't mean that we're in a state without war. So this is what Kant called perpetual peace. So a world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated, which from a Schmittian point of view is what, and here I'm going to be Schmitt and be a bit facetious to bring the thrust of the point, all good neoliberals and socialists, this is what they're dreaming of. We'll see Bertrand Russell, Romain Rolland, I mean, this great tradition of pacifist reactions to the First World War, and especially in the aftermath of the First World War, right? The war to end all wars. A world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated, which indeed is one of the great projects of Europe, of the European Union. A completely pacified globe would be a world without the distinction of friend and enemy, and hence a world without politics. So what he's trying to say is that a world in which there would be perpetual peace would be a world in which there's no politics. So in a sense, the aim of politics cannot be perpetual peace. Because the aim of, that's what he's saying. And then he says, look, it's very conceivable that the world might contain very many interesting contrast competitions. Of course, there'll be conflicts in a social sense. Football teams will still be in conflict, rivalries between analytic and continental philosophers, et cetera, et cetera. But there would be no true politics because there would be no possibility of war. So a world without the possibility of war is a world without politics. And that's why he says war as the most extreme political means discloses the possibility which underlies every political idea. So that's where he tries to close the equation. Politics is not always armed conflict, but what armed conflict reveals is the very essence of politics. Precisely because as the most extreme instrument, if you wish, it reveals that politics is itself the pursuit of war, where armed conflict is another means of doing it, which reveals the nature of the political. So I'll just read it again. War as the utmost extreme political means discloses the possibility which underlies every political idea. And what underlies every political idea is the antagonism or the confrontation between friend and enemy, namely that I perceive the other as an existential threat to us, and therefore that I recognize us as friends. And here I know I keep saying I'll say one more thing, but it's interesting that on page 45, there's a really fascinating footnote, again, historically, where he goes back to this idea that, the possibility of friend-enemy distinction transcends all other associations as a general political. Then he has a footnote to, at the time, a quite important German sociologist and economist called Emil Lederer, an article written in 1915, so, in the heart of the war, Soziologie des Weltkrieges. We can say that on the day of mobilization, the hitherto existing society was transformed into a community. And if you read in the MOOC, the Kaiser's unity speech, so on August 2nd, I forget, August 2nd or 3rd, Kaiser Wilhelm goes to the balcony in Berlin and announces that Germany has declared war. And that speech is known the unity speech, because he says, basically, it's a great thing that there's this war, because now we know who is our friends. We can look at each other and say, we are part of the same community. We finally have unity, such that the mechanism of the political is not just the declaration and therefore the recognition of the other as the enemy, but now, truly, we are one. Everyone is New York. Everyone is America. Right? That famous headline from Le Monde after 9/11. So this is what Schmitt is trying to, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it's implied that this sense of community, of genuine community, that genuine friendship in this sense is essential to politics. And think of, again, I'm not so familiar with the rhetoric here in Europe, but in the US, Obama, the family of Americans, we Americans, we are a family. So it's interesting that it's a language of intimacy, of closeness. It's the politics of friendship, which, as you know, there's a quite extraordinary set of lectures by Derrida problematizing precisely this idea, the idea of the politicization of friendship, and in which, among other things, if you read I think they're one of Derrida's more brilliant lecture courses later in his life, called The Politics of Friendship, where he has an extensive attempt to sort of look at the complexities of this Schmittian idea of friendship as constituted through the distinction of friend and enemy, and the political notion of friendship, the political capital that we invest in this notion of friendship. And here I just want to call your attention to this footnote, which again anchors it quite specifically to the experience of the First World War in Germany. This notion of mobilization and the way in which society, so in German it's Gesellschaft, becomes Gemeinschaft, becomes a sense of true unity, where we see each other as the true friend. Even though I know, you're from Oklahoma, I have no idea who you are, but now you're my friend. We have solidarity. And that's what Schmitt, in a sense, and that solidarity is genuinely political. So it's not the solidarity of a social association, which would be the solidarity of, we're all, and I'm going to use American references, Red Sox fans, and we hate the Yankees, right? That, for Schmitt, is not a political antagonism. It becomes a political antagonism where now Red Sox Nation becomes truly a nation and starts, having the possibility of bombing New York, which of course would seem absurd. But it's interesting that, again, if you're from New England, they call it Red Sox Nation, so you can see the intensity of the conflict draws on a political vocabulary. Okay, so maybe we can discuss it. So this is basically, we can take a few moments because there's different pieces, and again, I just want to show that the different pieces are quite complex and there's different ways in which one can read it, before we then move to look at sovereignty, so to sort of segment a bit our discussion such that we can sort of stay focused. The next point then, after we discuss this Schmittian sort of idea of politics and war, which I've just set up, is then the notion of sovereignty, because then this leads him to the notion of sovereignty. Remember, he begins by saying, I don't want to presuppose the notion of sovereignty. I want to get to what is the political. Now that he has the political, he says, now I'm going to tell you what it means to have the political entity called sovereignty. But I think, sorry.
Just a comment when you were talking about the idea of the political always having more sort of in the background. I was reminded of Theodore Roosevelt walks off and carrying a big stick. And it was a really big idea at the time. Is that the big stick is, we can always crush you.
Well, we'll see that when we get to how Schmitt thinks about law, and especially his critique of human rights, he will formulate his own variation of the idea that law and the order of nomos is established through violence, through power. So might makes right. So the idea that any system of law is itself based on a kind of original violence. And that's going to also be his critique of human rights. And so that's going to be the way, again, I don't want to jump ahead too much, that the sovereignty is the state of exception, because it's the exception to law, to norms. But on the other hand, itself is the act or the violence which institutes norms. And we'll see that there's a quite striking passage where many people, the most severe critics of Schmitt, especially who read Schmitt very closely within the context of National Socialism, will point to this one passage which we'll jump to and say, in this passage, which we'll jump to, Schmitt is already setting up a kind of argument to defend Germany against war crimes. Because we'll see that he's going to neutralize quite subtly the very idea of war crimes. And this he's doing in 1927. Remember, he's a jurist. So it's someone who understands international law very well. And we'll come to that passage in a moment. Perhaps the most contentious, one of the most contentious passages in Schmitt, where you see very clearly that there cannot be war crimes. Because, in a sense, justice is completely removed from the equation of war. And, of course, there's tremendous consequences for that.
Clausewitz said that, too.
Yes, but when Clausewitz says it in 1831, and also Clausewitz says that, but remember that if we hold this contrast, so if we use it as a heuristic device to organize our thinking, that Schmitt can be read in the light of Clausewitz as the inversion of Clausewitz's formula, then what that means is that when we go back to Clausewitz, and this was a question that someone had raised, even though Clausewitz says, look, ethical considerations fall outside of the concept of war, it's not opening a window to legitimating unethical actions or accepting that there is no distinction, partly because there's a kind of notion of professionalism which is implicit, but also because ultimately, and this is what the French philosopher Raymond Aron really argues in his book that he writes in the 60s in French called Penser la guerre Clausewitz, which is one of the great interpretations of Clausewitz by a philosopher. He says, look, the key thing about Clausewitz is that at the end of the day, war is always an instrument of politics. And politics is always connected to a system of rights and laws and international laws. So ultimately, even if Clausewitz doesn't say much about the relationship between war and ethics and says, look, ethics falls outside of the concept of war. So because by the logic of his own thinking, war must always be subservient to politics, and politics is always inscribed in a system of laws for which there is no exception, then implicitly it means that there is something like just wars, unjust wars, war crimes, etc. That's what Raymond Aron argues in his book. So the contrast is that we'll see with Schmitt is that Schmitt is much more inviting of the consequence that, as we'll see, though some people think it's just outright contradictory for reasons I'll get into, that there cannot be anything called the just war. So one cannot justify war through a body of laws, saying, look, we have to go to war because of the Geneva Convention or human rights, etc. Schmitt thinks that kind of appeal is, he has a kind of cynical attitude. It already presupposes the decision or the pursuit of war. It already presupposes the distinction of the enemy and instrumentalizes law in order to justify something, which in a sense is already existentially established. So it's a kind of cynicism to say, look, nations like America who say, look, we're going to invade Iraq and appeal to the United Nations, that for Schmitt is pure politics because it's absolutely cynical. But that's the important difference with Clausewitz, that in Clausewitz there's still a sense that, again, if you follow especially how Raymond Aron insists, that there's a clear sense that there are just wars and unjust wars, and just wars are those, in a sense, that are not subservient to politics or to political aims which are not rational, as well as a space in his thinking to say that there's a space for something like war crimes, even if at the time it wasn't developed as a concept. Whereas in Schmitt, we'll see that's what many people find very troubling about Schmitt, especially when you read it, as I said, in the historical context. Yes, Meredith?
I'm wondering about what's supposed in this definition of friend and enemy, because a friend is apparently someone or people that are similar or the same as friends, and the enemies are different. And that leads to this notion of a unified community that's necessarily very homogeneous, and such that
not only doesn't allow for cultural or diversity or any kind of diversity, but it also seems to imply that the only motor of change is war or civil war.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think Schmitt, actually Schmitt thinks that it goes in the opposite direction, is your question. So when Schmitt makes the distinction between, when Schmitt says, look, there are all kinds of conflicts and groupings, social groupings, so I'll choose a more neutral vocabulary. There are many kinds of social conflicts and social groupings where different groups are against each other for different aims, economic aims, symbolic aims, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just take two simple examples. Sports, right? I'm a fan of this team, you're a fan of that team. And then, of course, economics. I'm at Volkswagen, right, trying to cheat people and make money, and you're a Toyota, things like that. So Schmitt's point is that there's a tremendous diversity, which is cultural, sociological, and those diversity is diversity of groups that are in some sense in conflict with each other. But those conflicts aren't political. They become political when, and now I'm going to use his vocabulary, they reach a certain pitch of intensity. And the pitch of that intensity is existential. Namely, the other is now seen as an existential threat. And part of what that structure of perception and decision, because again, it also means that it's a decision, which is important for Schmitt because it means that there are no eternal enemies. So those who, under certain conditions, are seen as genuinely political enemies, the German and French for 300-400 years, up until 1945, can finally have a world in which they're not enemies, namely today. So Schmitt thinks that his notion is that political antagonism is something that he says that transcends social distinctions, social antagonism. So they're not the same as social distinctions, social antagonisms. They transcend because they also require or open the space for something called the state. But because any kind of social antagonism potentially can be elevated to a political antagonism, then it means that, and this is quite important for Schmitt, there is no substantial definition of politics for him. And the sense of unity that we have when we recognize each other as unified under the auspices of a political antagonism is not one that then reduces all other differences among us. And here, the historical example, I think, for Schmitt, again, is Germany. That with the outbreak of and you see this in the Kaiser's speech, the idea is, look, you're from Bavaria and you don't understand the guy from Pomeria because you speak completely different languages, basically, right? Of course, there's High German, and you're Protestant and you're Catholic. And you're a Hamburg bourgeois guy and you're a rural peasant from Neskirch, Heidegger's village. But you can still be those, but there is something that transcends the differences between Saxony, Pomeria, and that is we are German. And how one understands what it is to be German is in light of an existential conflict with the enemy. So Schmitt's view, and here what's quite striking, again I'll just jump ahead, though we'll come back and discuss it, is when he starts to think about the nation of the state, what's quite fascinating is the two thinkers that or the two political theorists that so this is in section 4. So section 4, he starts to think, okay, what is sovereignty? The two thinkers that he latches onto is, they're completely unknown now, but one is a British guy called Harold Laski. The other guy is a French legal theorist called Léon Debuy. They're both anarchist thinkers. So these are two very important socialist, basically anarchist thinkers who reject the notion of sovereignty as a person. So it's a very powerful anarchist critique of the state, that the state is not absolute power. In fact, there is no state. There is just associations a kind of federalism. And what's quite fascinating is Schmitt is like, yes, I agree with their critique of the state. So it's quite fascinating that Schmitt says, I agree with the anarchists. The state is a fiction. Or in his, it's much different. The state is the secularization of theological concepts, which is his claim in his book on political theology. That in a sense, theological concepts become secularized, and that is the logic of the modern nation state. And what's quite fascinating is that he accepts an anarchist critique of the state, but then his critique of the anarchists is to say, well, what you anarchists miss, because you're socialists and basically pacifists, is the idea that indeed the state is not a substantial entity, and it's also not a substantial identification. So what's interesting here is that Schmitt is also rejecting the idea of Gemeinschaft. So you may know that in Germany, the most important distinction for political thinkers and sociologists was a distinction formalized, if you wish, because it was sort of in the air, by a German sociologist called Ferdinand Tönnies. And if you read a lot of the literature in the First World War, and when you read Eucken, you'll see that this distinction is everywhere. When you read Husserl, it's sort of like a basic grammatical distinction at the level of concept. But a guy called Ferdinand Tönnies, and another guy called Werner Sombart. They're not well known today, but they were very important sociologists. At the time, at the level of Max Weber, the great sociologist. But they make a distinction in German between what they call Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft. And in that quote that Schmitt takes from this guy, this other sociologist, Emile Lederer, this is the distinction that's invoked. And Gesellschaft is translated into English roughly as society, but Gesellschaft is very specific. It's almost a technical notion. It means a society of individuals where their individualism prevails over the sense of being together. So from Tönnies and Sombart, the problem with modernization is that it's the increased fragmentation of social bonds through individualization, which is the consequence of capitalism and consumer culture. There's no true sense of unity and bonding. And against that, they argued for the primacy of Gemeinschaft. So in English, community. So the idea where the identification with the group prevails over individual. And there's and also in this way, they often use metaphors of mechanization. It's like being in a machine, or atomization. I mean, it's the most dominant metaphor is the machine metaphor. We're all cogs in the wheel, welcome to the machine, we're all alienated. The Lonely Crowd, which is a very important book of an American sociologist. So the idea is that that's what modernity is, the experience of mass fragmentation, mass social fragmentation, and no true sense of solidarity. And what we need is Gemeinschaft. And in Gemeinschaft, at least in these views of people like Tönnies and Sombart, and we'll see with Eucken, Gemeinschaft means robust identification where everyone, these differences are equalized because we're all of the same group. Now what's interesting is that Schmitt actually rejects this distinction. Well, he doesn't reject this distinction, but his notion of the political is not a notion of Gemeinschaft. And that's, in a sense, why he latches onto the anarchists. Because the anarchists, or at least the anarchists that he quotes, are also suspicious of Gemeinschaft. Partly because this is a really trenchant critique of the French guy Begriff. Who you may know that the first article that Jean-Paul Sartre ever published was a fascinating article on theories of the nation, theories of the state in modern French thought. He publishes it in 1927. He's a Normalien. And he has a whole discussion of Begriff. And you already see that Sartre is attracted to anarchist political thinking. the rejection of a robust notion of sovereignty of the state, etc. So it's his first publication is among other things looking at critiques of the state in French thinking at the beginning of the 20th century, and the key figure was one of them was this guy called Degree. But Degree says, look, the problem with both of these is this is really a notion of the person that becomes now understood as a collective. And so it's a theological conception of God that becomes completely secularized. And so this is the anarchist critique that Schmitt follows, but then Schmitt says, look, so what Schmitt is saying is the kind of unity, the kind of sense of friends which emerges is not one in which all other differences are absorbed. But precisely it's a unity, an identity that transcends without reducing all of the social differentiations. That's why it doesn't produce community. Because if it produced community, then it would, from a Schmittian point of view, collapse politics into society, the social. And this is what he tells us in a footnote. So I'll just take some time to, because it's a good question. When he goes after the most important legal theorist in the neo-Kantian tradition at the time was a guy called Rudolf Stammler. Again, who today is forgotten, but Stammler was a tremendously important legal theorist who, in a sense, changed a lot of the ways in which philosophers even today think about the nature of law, the concept of law. And he was a neo-Kantian. And Stammler, because you may know that neo-Kantianism had a tremendous impact on the development of 20th century philosophy of law, international relations. In fact, Adolf Reinach, so this is a footnote, but in the MOOC, and I'm jumping into the MOOC, you'll read a text, fascinating text by the German philosopher Adolf Reinach, who was killed then in Belgium, in Dixmude, in 1917, and wrote this set of pages called, in German, it's called Über die Vorahnung, which means on foreboding. And it's about, I'm a soldier, I'm here, and we all know we're going to die. What is this sense of the anticipation of death? So in a very raw form, it's already this Heideggerian idea of being towards death, anticipation towards death. But Reinach, before the war, had written a very important text on law, kind of phenomenology of law, where, among other things, Reinach is the first to propose a speech act theory of law, that what laws are as social objects are performative utterances. So many people think that before Austin really put together a notion of speech act theory, Reinach already develops a speech act theory because Reinach is interested in understanding what kind of fact is a social law. What kind of social object is it? It's obviously not a physical object. Well, it's an object created in speech. It's a speech act. And so I mention this because the tremendous importance of neo-Kantianism and phenomenology on theories of law. But if you look at page 33, there's a very interesting reference to this guy, Rudolf Stammler. Now, as I mentioned, Rudolf Stammler is the most important neo-Kantian philosopher of law. And neo-Kantianism generally basically had a political philosophy which was socialist. It's also something maybe we'll come back to later in the semester, when that neo-Kantianism, Hermann Cohen, Paul Nator, who are viewed philosophically as conservative, this is the Heideggerian, these are conservative epistemology. Politically, they were very radical. They were very, for the time, they were socialists. And Stammler is the key theorist, legal theorist of neo-Kantian socialism. And so here, just to point where the rejection of community is, so you can see that when he says, look, Stammler's thesis, which is rooted in neo-Kantian thought, that the social idea is community, so it's Gemeinschaft, and he rejects that. What he's saying is, my notion of the political is not to be identified with the notion of Gemeinschaft. Precisely because the political transcends all the various identities of Gemeinschaft. So what's quite interesting about Schmitt is that he emphasizes strongly that politics as the declaration of the enemy produces a unity, a recognition of us as friends, which transcends social recognitions without reducing them, and which produces genuine unity, but that unity has no substance. Precisely because, and here I'm trying to be provocative, not to be provocative, but so you can think about that there's always a certain reach to Schmitt's thinking. In time of war, when the state says, the sovereign says, now we are at war, it doesn't matter if you come from North Dakota, Minnesota, New York, you're a Williamsburg hipster or whatever. Now we are in some, who we are has transcended without reducing that. And now we are all committed to something for which there is no space of neutrality. In a sense, you are either with us or you're against us. And in a sense, that's something what's transcendent about that power is precisely that it doesn't reduce social differences. That's, Schmitt says, is genuine politics. That's what politics is about. And that's why, I'll just round off this thing, it's quite interesting, the interesting affinities he has with anarchism. In this sense. Though, of course, in another sense, it's completely different because these anarchists are committed to a notion of perpetual peace, socialism. Again, I'm jumping into the MOOC to show you, hopefully, the complexity of the relations that we can explore. In the MOOC, we will read the most important anarchist in Germany, is a guy called Gustav Landauer. And Landauer writes this quite amazing, very cryptic text called On Revolution before the First World War, where again you see this critique of the state, etc., but it's all in the context of the horizon of a utopia, which would be perpetual peace. That's where Schmitt breaks off with the anarchists, but he substantially agrees with their notion of the critique of the state and the notion of a form of federalism, insofar that it's a plurality of associations, but he wants robust politics. And that robust politics is antagonism, is this condition of war. So that's sort of a long way to say that Schmitt, I think, wants to say that actually the kind of unity that is galvanized, where we recognize each other as friends, is one which, in a sense, allows for diversity, social diversity. That seems to be the argument, because it's not a social bond. And because it's not Gemeinschaft, it's something else. I lost track of.
Sorry, but if their social diversity is possible, then what about the Jews? I mean, why cannot they be friends?
Well, so within the context of Schmitt's argument, they're the enemy.
Sometimes we can become.
Oh yeah, of course, yes. So I mean, that's why Schmitt is Schmitt is slippery. He's slippery because Schmitt says there is no permanent enemy. So there is no eternal enemy. Once the enemy has been declared, and this is what people find so troubling about it, in the context of National Socialism, Germany. Once the enemy has been declared, then the enemy is beyond the state of law. Meaning everything is permissible. Because to declare the other as the enemy is to inscribe the other in a space which is defined by the permanent possibility of killing. And moreover, and maybe I'll take your question to jump, because again I'm also trying to do time management here, to jump to what I consider, especially in the context of this issue, is the most incendiary part of the book. Many people point to this and say, look, this is really where you see what Schmitt is setting up. In a sense, so the most severe and harshest critiques of Schmitt say, here you already see the preparation for the rejection of the Nuremberg trials after the war. So this is in 1927. He's already thinking, because he says here, this is on page 49, I'll just read it and then we can continue the discussion. There exists, again I'll read it, it's a very categorical statement. There exists no rational purpose, no norm no matter how true, no program no matter how exemplary, no social ideal no matter how beautiful, no legitimacy nor legality which could justify men in killing each other for this reason. And it's quite striking that he takes the pains to make this list. So basically, as he says earlier in a more sort of cynical, to demand seriously of human beings that they kill others and be prepared to die themselves so that trade and industry may flourish for the survivors, or that the purchasing power of grandchildren may grow, is sinister and crazy. So what he's saying is that there is no norm. So in a sense, there is nothing to die for. There is no idea to die for. And there is no legitimacy or legality that could justify war. That's what he says here. And then he said, if such physical destruction of human life is not motivated by an existential threat to one's own way of life, then it cannot be justified. Just as little as war can be justified by ethical and juristic norms. So, what's so complex about that statement and what many people find so disturbing is he's saying, okay, there is no such thing as just war. Precisely because war is the exception from legality. And also there is no reason for war. If by reason we mean ideas that we die for. God, etc. For Schmitt, even people who say, I die for God, the idea of God has become politicized through an antagonism. So in a sense, the idea is itself an instrument. Because he says the only thing that, and this is what's complicated, the only thing that justifies war, so war, there is no justification for war. The only thing that justifies it is an existential threat to one's own way of life. And then, to go back to your question, then the question is, well, if we've declared the other to be the enemy, it is that act of declaration itself which is the justification for the destruction of the other. But since that act of declaration is one which opens up a space that is outside legality, then the other is constituted as someone who is outside the space of law. And such that there is no justification for war other than the declaration that the other is an enemy. And so here, what a number of people argue is at least two things. One is they say, well, this already sets up the idea that if one understands war as an existential conflict, then by definition, there cannot be war crimes. Why? Because Schmitt is saying that war is a space that is extra, it's outside legality. But on the other hand, what he's saying is that this existential decision that the other is the enemy is the only justification. So you can see how, again, you could say he wants to have it both ways. He wants to say there is no justification for war. We can't appeal to norms. We can't appeal to values. One of the consequences of that is that, as many people have emphasized, this is the real insight of Schmitt, war is the state of exception. The most important theorist today who is really fascinated by this idea and takes it in a certain direction, though then he wants to not take all of Schmitt with him, is the Italian philosopher Agamben. And then people who wrote a book called The State of Exception. And then after 9/11, many people, like Judith Butler and others say, Guantanamo, that's exactly it. Because what is Guantanamo? Guantanamo is America has decided that the other is, this other, Al-Qaeda, is the enemy. And once that decision has been made, then it opens up a space which is outside the law. Now, in the context of Schmitt's thinking in the 20s and 30s, many historians have shown that Schmitt was instrumental in redesigning the German legal system, because he was a jurist in the 30s, such that as soon as you now have individuals who are stateless and who are declared the enemy, then they are in a zone which is morally neutral, and anything is permitted on them. So precisely to your question, that's what many people say, what Schmitt is doing here, he's already establishing a conceptual space to say that whatever occurs in a time of war, which is existential, is outside of the law. And it's that declaration of the other as the enemy, which in itself is the performative act which justifies, now again, you can question whether there's any meaning here to justification, justifies such that in the context of the Nuremberg trials, because Schmitt also rejected the Nuremberg trials, says, it's a time of war. So you can't now retroactively apply a set of laws. And what's interesting is that in the context of the First World War, we'll see with Eucken, and that's why we're going to do Eucken next, you see exactly this kind of thinking set up in the First World War. So Eucken, to anticipate, will precisely say that. He'll say, look, there's two kinds of wars. There's wars that are disagreements about, land, economy, things like that. And then there's existential wars, where what is at stake is the very existence of a people. The present war is an existential war. And in the present war, yes, it's too bad that Leuven was destroyed and books were burned, because this is actually the context of Eucken's speech. But state of emergency, again, I'm being a bit facetious, but we'll see, it's a real argument now. It may be a flawed argument, but it's an argument that's being made. And I think what's interesting is you see how Schmitt is in that tradition and then radicalizes it such that the problematic question, and you're absolutely right, is then, if the Jew is the enemy, and has been declared such by the sovereign, then from a Schmittian universe, you don't have much room to maneuver to say, well, there is something called laws of war, ethical, et cetera, but also you have this maneuver that there's no justification. You cannot call it unjust because you cannot appeal to the vocabulary of justification, precisely because there is no justification for war other than the decision itself. So this is what political theorists call a decisionist conception of politics. Decisionist in the sense that there's no appeal to justification other than the decision itself. And then the question of whether the decision is based on truth and things like that seem to be secondary. And this is where, again, we can continue, but this is also where people are also quite fascinated by why Schmitt and Heidegger felt an affinity, because many people think that there's also a kind of decisionist conception in Heidegger's thinking. All this, we'll get to it when we look at Heidegger's analysis of being towards death. The sense of resoluteness, this emphasis on we need to make the decision, we need to have resolve in the face of death, and that somehow is an ontological transformation of our relationship to ourselves and to the other. And so many people think that's really the way in which to understand the intellectual lineage that connects Schmitt and Heidegger, is this decisionist conception of let's call it the political. Yeah, or do you? We can still talk. And I don't want the awkwardness that I've answered, but if you want to say something, but
two things I think still bother me. Articulate both. First is following on your answer to Lavinia, this notion of the fact that the state, sovereignty, declares the enemy in a way makes it quite the opposite of what you called last week the minimal state. The state is everything, at least potential. The state can be everything the minute it decides to be everything. The minute it declares war, it can absorb everything. It can absorb the social, the sphere, the economic sphere. It can become everything. It has a total demand, and in a way, Schmitt here already formulates totalitarianism, right, or justifies,
yeah.
the right word, totalitarianism. So this is the first point. I'd love to hear what you think about it. And then the second is that, in a way, the way you interpret the relation between Schmitt and the First World War puzzles me, because it contradicts some of the things I thought about uniqueness, about the Great War. I thought that before this war, wars were thought of as positive things, right? This is where the positive in man comes out. They are the zone of heroism, where the best in you is realized, right, and in the First World, in the battlefield of the First World War, when thousands of men were slaughtered every day without being able to be heroes, without doing anything, just there in the trenches, anonymous death, and of course machine gun or chemical weapons that killed masses of people. And my previous notion of the First World War was that it changed the conception of war from, you keep mentioning Kant and the perpetual peace, eternal peace, of course. He's ironic himself when he uses this term. This term fits the inn when you drink beer and everything taken from an inn, or the cemetery. And Kant, of course, says things like, in times of peace, the shit, black, comes out.
Rubbish.
It's problematic, right? In times of war, things happen, brings the best in us. All this to say that after the First World War, more or less, people start to realize that war is terrible. That war is a price that cannot be paid by humanity, or something like that. So in this sense, I was always reading Schmitt as in a way the last thinker of the pre-World War time. As in a way the last big thinker to valorize war. Of course, it's never just, but it is important. We don't want a world without wars. War constitutes something that is essential to us, to our living together. Without war, our lives are meaningless. And this, in a way, I thought is a pre-First World War understanding of what war is.
So maybe I'll do this, because the second question is a very complicated question. No, it's a great question. So let me start with the first question, which is also complicated, but less complicated. Less complicated because the second question is a massive question about the transformation of the concept of war in the First World War. So with the first question, there's different ways in which you can understand the notion of a minimalist state. You're absolutely right that, in one sense, when Schmitt speaks about the sovereign as a political entity which transcends social associations, and that transcending of social associations hinges on the intensification of an antagonism, that then it has the capacity to draw, to use your language, on all aspects of society in the interest of this antagonism. But that's different than the notion, but that's not antithetical to Schmitt's argument, and this is where I think the fact that he has such affinity with anarchist thinkers is quite revealing, that he has an anarchist notion of the critique of the state, which is precisely that the state should not be defined by social and economic concerns. So it's a minimum.
Okay.
But it's not. So it says So Schmitt is very clear, and this is his whole critique of democracy and neoliberalism, is that the problem with democracy and neoliberalism is that increasingly the state becomes defined by social and economic concerns. But the state is much more for him, in one sense, restricted, because it is fundamentally about the antagonism between friend and enemy. Now that antagonism can draw on different aspects, and indeed can draw on the totality of a society. But the state itself is not concerned, and therefore doesn't take on the responsibilities of social causes, economic causes, etc. And that's what when he then says, again, that's why I think that it's quite important that he is very accepting of these anarchist critiques. He says, yes, I agree with the critique of anarchism to the state, that actually the state has no business with social relations of human beings. That's all a kind of federalism. What I object to the anarchists is that now they no longer have a notion of the state at all. And I want a notion of the state which is through this notion of the political. Now, the idea that you vocalized in your comments about, well, if the antagonism between friend and enemy can draw and mobilize on all the resources of a state, of a society, and that is, if you wish, the blueprint for something like totalitarianism, that's actually much closer to Foucault. Because what Foucault will do in the lectures, One Must Defend Society, and this is where I think Foucault goes one step further than Schmitt. Because what Foucault says is, look, if politics is fundamentally conflict, then the fundamental structure of all power is social war. Because there is no antagonism in which it's not an antagonism which is not modeled on war. Whether that is feminism, gay rights, et cetera, all of this is something like a state of war. And so what Foucault does is he radicalizes and says precisely that this is the transformation of society, let's call it society and war, where now we don't realize it, but basically what politics is the permanent state of war. And that is, for Foucault, as you know, not only the model of totalitarianism, but much more critically, it's our capitalist society. I think that's the difference between Foucault and Schmitt, is that Schmitt still has this sense that there is an anarchist notion of the state with a state, whereas the anarchists want to get rid of the state completely. And that's the way in which then all of, again, just to repeat myself, that's his critique. That's also why it's not Gemeinschaft, because it doesn't absorb everything into it. It transcends, and I think the key term is that it transcends. Doesn't absorb. So that's why I think there still is a kind of anarchism in his thinking, negatively. Though of course it's when we read Landau.
The critique of liberal democracy is central of national law as embodying the state. He shares this with.
Yes, but the interesting thing here is that what he really draws out is what he sort of says. What I agree with the anarchists is their rejection of a maximal notion of the state, if that means that it increasingly absorbs this, right? That's what I accept. That's their insight. And then, of course, I'm going to, with the second question, good, I only have 20 seconds, but it's a very complicated question for a number of reasons, so maybe what I can do is I'll just make some signposts. The first one is, I'll put it this way, does Schmitt end a tradition of thinking about war, or does he begin one? Or does he stand in the middle of one? Now, you're absolutely right that, and this is something that we'll see in other authors, but though it's not present in Schmitt, in Eucken and Husserl, this idea of war as rejuvenation of human virtues. That war is ethical in this sense, which it's not for Schmitt. That it's in time of war, and there's even in Kant, as you remember, there's statements where he says things like this, where in time of war, we become courageous, we become more generous, we rejuvenate our moral capacities, and so there's some kind of meaning in war. So war gives us something that is meaningful. Schmitt doesn't make that kind of argument because he thinks that's too ethical. But we'll see that people like Eucken will, and Husserl will as well. And that's in the context of the First World War. So in the context of the First World War, you have people who actually see the First World War as this opportunity to rejuvenate ethically Germany. And that's going to be the importance of Fichte for Eucken and Husserl, because Fichte is going to be the one that in the German context puts together this notion that war is an ethical project. So Schmitt doesn't want an ethical concept of war in that sense. And also, the big difference about the First World War and this previous tradition of, let's say, war as a positive force is that, and here there's a fantastic study by one of the great contemporary legal thinkers, a guy called James Whitley, who is, he's technically not a philosopher, but he's philosophical. He's a professor at Yale of international law. And he wrote a few years ago an absolutely fantastic book, which I would recommend to all, called The Verdict of Battle. Or The Verdict of War. Where he shows quite clearly that if you look at the conceptual space in which war was understood in the 17th and 18th century, up until the Napoleonic Wars, war is fundamentally a legal concept. So war is a decision-making process to adjudicate legal problems, namely inheritance of successorship of sovereignty and land claims. And he then shows that it's then beginning with the Napoleonic Wars, and then there's a kind of arc up until the advent of the First World War, and his book ends just before the First World War, where now war becomes understood, and that's called the Vertical battle, increasingly as an existential conflict. So the concept of war migrates from a legal concept or a legal space of thinking to an existential, where now we can have debates, as people have in the First World War, about war as revealing something about history, as revealing something about civilizations. And the key figures here in the 19th century is going to be Hegel. Because what Hegel does is he sort of understands war and inscribes it within a philosophy of history, which, as Whitman shows, was completely unthinkable prior to the 19th century. Because if you look at all, Grotius, Pufendorf, and all the discussions about war, yes, there's a discussion about war as virtues, martial virtues, etc. There's an understanding of war as solidarity and war as this legal process of making decisions bind, but there's no existential conception of war in this specific sense, that war decides something about a culture or reveals something about history. And so this is a kind of shorthand way to say that what's complicated about how you set up your question is that we would first have to agree to what is the right narrative to tell about the development of the concept of war from the 18th century to the First World War. If you adopt, as I'm here adopting, James Whitman's argument, what's distinctive of warfare beginning in the 19th century, which really comes to the head in the First World War, is precisely that we can use this language, war is existential. And existential in a very specific sense, so not just that there's a lot of destruction, but existential in the sense it's fundamental to a certain mode of life of human being, which is the political mode of life. And this is why now you have wars that can be wars between cultures and civilization, where we think that what's at stake, so this, hence the title, the verdict of war is something about the truth of a culture. So the clash of civilizations, the controversial Samuel Huntington, that's something that really is forged in the First World War. So that would be the way in which I would say that I wouldn't accept the narrative that, that Schmitt belongs to let's call it a pre-19th century or pre-late 19th century, precisely because Schmitt has all the vocabulary, which is a marker of war as existential, war as absolute. Now, here's another pitch to do something in the MOOC. If you go in the MOOC, why the first lecture is on Clausewitz and the second one is on colonialism is because what I try to suggest there is that the passage or the transformation of the notion of war from war is the pursuit of politics by other means to war is the existential condition of politics passes through the colonial experience. Because it's in colonialism that you first have the sense that the other is the inhuman. And the inhuman can be put in concentration camps, can be basically all the mechanisms of totalitarianisms are deployed already and invented. And here, the two most important conflicts is the Boer Wars in South Africa, and especially in the German context, it's the destruction of the Herero people in Namibia in 1904, 1905, with the first development of Konzentrationslager. So they weren't in the sense of the Holocaust, with crematoriums, etc., but they were basically, they deported thousands and thousands of the Herero people. They put them in camps and gave them no food and made them work, and basically they all perished. So this is the 1905 campaign in Namibia. And so the argument is that this transformation of war into this existential conflict of extermination, where the other is viewed as the enemy in this very aggressive sense, that one has to situate that in the context of colonialism. And of course, in the context of the First World War, if we had a much more extensive class, we would have to look at the Armenian genocide. Because the Armenian genocide, which is in 1915, one sees at the level of practice all of the recognizable practices of genocide: internment, deportation, mass killings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, within a context of the political. And this is what Sartre, in his quite brilliant analysis, argues. He says, look, the key thing about colonialism is that it sets up this notion of war between us who are human and the other who is inhuman, who are the barbarians. And therefore, anything is permitted to those barbarians, and they're constituted as other than human. So Sartre thinks that this is what's distinctive of European racism, that European racism is substantially tied to a transformation in the concept of war. So this would be, what I call the colonial prehistory of the First World War. And then one of the many interesting things about the First World War, and I'll end with this because I know we're past time, and it's now something that military historians have started to really research in the past 10 years, is that you see in all of the theaters of operation, so here in Belgium, in France, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc., that from the very first weeks of the war, you have shootings of civilians, deportations, the organization of camps. So you have, rampant war crimes. As you know, here in Belgium, something like 6,000 to 7,000 civilians were shot and executed in the first week. And the only first historical study that documented this was 10 years ago. So it's very late that historians are actually now showing that the practice of war in the opening weeks of the First World War was complete brutalization against civilian populations, etc. And you even see this is one of the assignments in your MOOC if you look at wartime propaganda. Because basically, there's one of the great posters, it's an American poster that shows the German as a guerrilla. And it says, stop this brute. And if you compare Allied anti-war propaganda posters with propaganda posters of colonialism, you see the same image, right? The African as the barbaric King Kong who's going to steal our women, rape them, and run on top of the Empire State Building and threaten civilization, right? Because King Kong is the quintessential film of racism, of colonial experience. That iconography gets projected onto the Germans. So you see the transfer of a language of representation of the enemy as other than human, as barbarian, which is already set up. And then in the First World War, it's internalized within Europe, because then the Germans look at the French and say, look, they're the barbarians, etc. No, you asked a fascinating question. One could go on, but it's about, in a sense, your question goes to the heart of what this class is about, trying to understand what was the profound transformation in the concept of war, and then the concept of politics, civilization, etc., in the context of the First World War. No, we can continue. Thank you. So what we'll do, we'll continue Schmitt, and then we'll move to Eucken.